Emily Johnson was only 13 when her ordinary walk home from soccer practice spiraled into a nightmare, and Richard Carter, a man twice her parents' age, was waiting in the shadows with a plan that would shake the entire community. The Johnson family lived in a neighborhood where little ever went wrong, the kind of place where people waved to each other from their driveways and left their doors unlocked during the day. On that Thursday afternoon, the sun was beginning to sink low when Emily Johnson's mother stepped out onto the porch to look for her daughter. Emily had soccer practice after school, and she was usually home by 4. It wasn't unusual for her to linger with her friends at the field, but by 5 o'clock there was still no sign of her. By 6, worrying began to harden into fear. Emily was the sort of child who thrived on routine. She liked to keep her cleats lined up neatly by the back door and always tossed her backpack on the same chair before grabbing a snack. When those small rituals failed to appear, her mother knew something was wrong. The family began calling her phone, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. At first, her parents hoped her battery had died or that she had stopped at a friend's house without mentioning it. But when they began calling those friends one by one, no one had seen her since practice. The police were called just after nightfall. Officers arrived quickly, aware that every minute mattered. They asked the usual questions: what Emily had been wearing, who she normally walked home with, if she had ever talked about running away. Her parents shook their heads. Emily wasn't rebellious, and she wasn't secretive. She was 13 years old, with a fondness for sketching in her notebook and a habit of humming songs while she did her homework. The thought of her disappearing without explanations seemed impossible. Detectives drove to the school field where practice had been held. The floodlights were already off, and the area looked deserted, but a custodian confirmed he had seen the soccer team leaving earlier in the afternoon. Interviews with teammates painted a clearer picture. Emily had played as usual, laughing during drills, stretching out on the grass afterward. Nothing seemed strange until one girl mentioned that Emily left with unusual urgency, clutching her phone tightly and glancing at it more than once as if she was waiting for something. That detail made the detectives pause. If Emily had been meeting someone, who could it have been? Her mother insisted she didn't know of any new friends. At home, officers requested permission to check Emily's room. What they found there was both ordinary and unsettling. Posters of her favorite band lined the walls, and a pile of homeworks at half finished on her desk. But the phone charger on the nightstand was empty, meaning Emily had taken her device with her. The investigators knew that in many missing child cases, digital clues often provided the first breakthrough. Back at the station, detectives began the urgent process of securing Emily's phone records. They needed to know who she had been communicating with in the hours before she vanished. Meanwhile, neighbors and volunteers fanned out across the area, searching parks, alleys, and wooded trails. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness as calls of her name echoed into the night. What had begun as a normal afternoon was quickly turning into every parent's worst nightmare. Detectives worked quickly once they had Emily's phone records in hand. The screen lit up with a string of recent messages, and the most frequent contact was listed under the name Daniel. According to the conversations, Daniel claimed to be 15 years old and went to a school across town. At first glance, the chats seemed harmless talks about music, sports, and the latest shows. But when investigators read deeper, the tone changed. The language felt polished, carefully constructed, almost as though the person on the other side was trying too hard to sound young. The timestamps revealed that Emily had been messaging Daniel constantly in the days leading up to her disappearance. The exchanges were often late at night, lasting long after she should have been asleep. One particular message from the day she vanished caught the detective's attention. "Can T wait to finally meet you? Don't tell anyone." The words carried a chill, pointing to the possibility that Emily had left practice intending to see this person in secret. Investigators traced the digital trail behind Daniel's account. What they discovered confirmed their suspicions. The phone number linked to the profile wasn't tied to any teenager. Instead, it belonged to an older prepaid device registered with false details. When they dug further, the IP addresses used to log into the account pointed back to a single location, a small house only a few miles from Emily's neighborhood. The realization hit hard. Emily's disappearance was no longer a mystery of chance. It was the result of someone deliberately planning to lure her. Officers began to research the person connected to the address. The name that came up was Richard Carter, a 42-year-old man with no close relatives in the area. His record showed a few minor infractions, nothing that screamed danger at first glance, but the digital evidence painted a darker picture. Carter had set up multiple fake profiles, each one pretending to be a young boy or girl. The conversations showed a consistent pattern: earning trust, offering compliments, and then encouraging secrecy. Emily had been pulled into the same trap. The team knew they had to move carefully. If Carter suspected he was being watched, Emily's safety could be at greater risk. Surveillance was set up near the small, aging house on Brookside Lane, the same property tied to the online accounts. Curtains stayed closed at all hours, and the yard was overgrown, giving the impression of a place people rarely visited. A single car sat in the driveway, rarely moving. As the detectives monitored the home, they reviewed more of the online evidence. Other messages hinted at meetings that had been attempted with different children, though none seemed to have gone as far as Emily's. The scope of the situation grew larger with every file uncovered. Carter wasn't improvising. He was organized, meticulous, and practiced. For the families waiting at home, each hour stretched unbearably long. For investigators, every second carried weight. They now had a name, an address, and the sinking knowledge that a child's life might depend on how quickly they acted. The house on Brookside Lane looked ordinary from a distance, but up close it gave off an unsettling air. The paint on the siding was faded, the blinds inside the windows never shifted, and the yard was littered with weeds tall enough to swallow the fence posts. Detectives who sat in unmarked cars nearby noticed that the mailbox was always overflowing, yet lights flickered inside at odd hours. For 3 days they watched quietly, noting every movement. A shadow crossed a window once, the curtains stirred another time, but no one ever stepped outside for long. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. When the search warrant was finally secured, officers assembled before dawn. The plan was swift and precise: enter quickly, secure the suspect, and search every room. The silence of the street made their boots sound louder than usual as they approached. With a loud crack, the front door was forced open, and the team rushed inside. The air was stale and thick, people with dust carrying the scent of damp wood and unwashed clothes. The first sweep of the house revealed clutter in every corner. Newspapers were stacked in piles against the walls, dishes with dried food were scattered on counters, and heavy curtains blocked out nearly all daylight. Each room seemed to close in, but the search pushed deeper. Then came the locked door at the bottom of a narrow staircase. The handle rattled but wouldn't budge. Officers didn't hesitate. A battering tool struck once, twice, before the door gave way. The basement was dim and suffocating. Old furniture lined the walls, but in the far corner stood a makeshift room built from plywood and metal bars. Inside, crouched on the floor, was Emily. Her soccer backpack rested at her side, and her face was pale from fear and exhaustion. When officers called her name, she looked up with wide eyes, clutching the straps of her bag as though it were a lifeline. She was alive, but the sight left no doubt that she had been trapped against her will. The small enclosure had no windows and barely enough space for her to lie down. A thin blanket covered the concrete floor, and a single light bulb flickered overhead. The door to the enclosure had been secured from the outside with heavy padlocks. It was a room designed to keep someone hidden, unseen, and unheard. The rescue was urgent, but care was taken not to overwhelm her. She was gently guided upstairs into the daylight for the first time in days. While one group escorted Emily to safety, another searched the rest of the house. They found evidence of preparation food supplies stacked in crates, extra locks and drawers, and electronic devices scattered across a desk. On the kitchen table, open notebooks filled with names, ages, and strange notes hinted at the suspect's disturbing planning. The man they had been watching, Richard Carter, was discovered crouching near the back of the house as though he had been trying to decide whether to flee. He was restrained without resistance, the once quiet street now filled with flashing lights and the sound of radios, but for the officers carrying Emily into safety. The mission had reached its most critical moment. The child they feared might vanish forever was now out of the dark basement and back in the open air. Richard Carter sat in custody while detectives pieced together the life he had been hiding in plain sight. On the surface, he appeared to be an unremarkable man, middle-aged, unemployed, and living alone. Neighbors described him as quiet, the kind of person who kept to himself and rarely spoke. Yet the investigation into his house told a much different story. Behind the locked doors and drawn curtains, Carter had constructed an elaborate system to create and maintain false identities online. The devices seized from his home revealed the scope of his deception. Multiple laptops, prepaid phones, and external hard drives were carefully labeled and stored. Each one contained accounts under different names, all crafted to appear as if they belonged to teenagers. The photographs were stolen from unsuspecting children across the internet, and the messages carried the same pattern of grooming, compliments, jokes, reassurance, and then secrecy. For investigators, it became clear that Emily was not the first child he had targeted. She was simply the one who had been lured far enough to be trapped. The notebooks found in the basement added an even darker layer. Inside were handwritten details, names, schools, interests, and what Carter described as vulnerabilities. He had studied his victims as though they were assignments, cataloging which children seemed lonely, which ones complained about parents, and which ones were eager for friendship. Emily's name appeared more than once, marked with notes about her love for soccer and her trusting nature. To the detectives reading those pages, it was chilling evidence of premeditation. As investigators traced his online activity further, they uncovered attempts to communicate with children in neighboring towns. Some had ignored him, some had chatted briefly before cutting contact, but a few had carried on longer conversations. Each one followed the same disturbing arc, Carter posing as a peer, offering comfort, then slowly pushing the boundary until he suggested meeting in person. Fortunately, Emily's rescue stopped the cycle before it could claim more victims, but the digital evidence suggested the danger had been ongoing for years. The prosecution built their case around the mountain of evidence, the online personas, the recorded conversations, the hidden basement room, and Emily's testimony. Every detail painted Carter as someone who had carefully plotted his crimes with patience and precision. What surprised even seasoned investigators was his ability to mask his intentions so thoroughly. To the outside world he was invisible, blending into the background of the community, yet privately he was orchestrating schemes to exploit children. Emily's discovery shifted the case from suspicion to certainty. The presence of the locked room made it impossible for Carter to argue that he had no harmful intent. The false walls, the padlocks, the supplies all demonstrated a plan to hold a child for an extended period. When detectives presented these findings, it was clear that this was not the impulsive act of a troubled man. It was the calculated work of a predator who had perfected his methods over time, only to be exposed through the courage of one girl's recovery and the persistence of law enforcement. The days following the rescue were filled with relief, but also with the difficult reality of what had unfolded. Emily was returned to her family under the watchful care of doctors and counselors. She was safe, but the experience had left invisible marks. At 13, she had faced a situation far beyond what any child should ever endure. Her parents stayed close, never letting her out of sight, while neighbors brought meals and words of comfort. The community that once felt untouched by such dangers now carried the heavy awareness that evil had been lurking right among them. Law enforcement worked tirelessly to ensure the case against Richard Carter was airtight. Prosecutors compiled every message, every file, and every journal entry into a timeline that showed exactly how he had planned and executed his crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving little room for doubt. Carter faced charges that included kidnapping, child endangerment, and multiple counts of online exploitation. The weight of the charges meant he would never again walk freely in society. As the legal process unfolded, more families came forward. Some recognized usernames from the list of accounts investigators had uncovered, realizing their children had also been contacted by Carter in the past. Thankfully, none had been taken as far as Emily, but the knowledge that he had tried shook them deeply. Parents who had once assumed their children's devices were harmless tools for games and homework were now confronted with the hidden dangers of the digital world. Community meetings were organized where law enforcement explained how predators operate online and what signs parents should watch for. Emily's case became more than just a crime story, it became a turning point for the town. Schools began hosting workshops on internet safety, encouraging students to speak openly if they felt uncomfortable about interactions online. Police officers partnered with teachers to give presentations about secrecy, manipulation, and the importance of never meeting strangers alone. Awareness grew out of tragedy, and while nothing could erase what had happened, it offered a shield of knowledge for others. For Emily, recovery was a gradual process. At first, she struggled to sleep without waking in fear. The locked basement room, the flickering light bulb, the sound of heavy padlocks, these memories clung to her mind. With time, therapy, and the support of her loved ones, she began to rebuild her sense of safety. Small steps marked her progress, going back to school, returning to soccer practice, smiling again at things she once enjoyed. Her bravery inspired those around her, a reminder that survival was possible even in the darkest circumstances. When the trial finally reached its conclusion, Carter was sentenced to decades in prison. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, a collective exhale of justice served. Emily sat beside her parents, her hand tightly held, knowing that the man who had stolen her sense of security would never have the chance to harm her or anyone else again. What began as an ordinary afternoon had unraveled into terror, but it ended with a child's return, a predator unmasked, and a community forever changed by the truth they could no longer ignore.